This is Branko Malić of Kali Tribune. In this episode of our forever ongoing podcast, Basic Notions of Metaphysics, we're going to talk about a concept or notion that I am very frequently going on about, and that's the notion of system and the place of system in metaphysics, or maybe better to say inversion of metaphysics that we are dealing with somewhere from around beginning of the New Age. By New Age I don't mean, of course, 20th century New Age, but the period that marks the transition from the Renaissance to modernity. Now for this podcast, to make matters as sharp and comprehensible as possible, I chose to talk about notion of system in classical German Idealism. The reason why is that classical German Idealism that is the philosophy that was most clear about the necessity of the existence of systems, not only for philosophy but for knowledge in general and for everything in general, of system being the cornerstone of metaphysics. And mind you, they understood it, the philosophy that is, and systems philosophy as metaphysics. I do this because today systems are ever-present form in which people understand the world, not only scientists but everybody more or less. But rarely does anybody tell you that there is such thing as metaphysics. Well, there is such thing as metaphysics, and it's ruling the hearts and minds of the people, not only thinking people, but all people capable of thinking, talking, and arguing about politics, for instance. LGBTIQ, for instance, this is the system. I won't talk about it that much here, but let's take it for example, and it could this by the way means that it can be very simply understood, not easily but simply, because it's a deductive system. The same applies for sustainable development, of which I talk frequently. It's also partly politics, but also partly systems ontology. And when you read books on history of philosophy, you will always find this word when talking about thinkers as Thomas Aquinas or Aristotle, to take two great names that connect antiquity and classical philosophy with Middle Ages and classical Christian transcendental philosophy. No such thing, as a matter of fact, exists in these two thinkers. There is no Thomas Aquinas system, there is no Aristotle system. It is very easy to demonstrate this, by the way, on Aristotle, believe it or not, because his works are scattered according to some notes, lecture notes, when we talk, for instance, about book Metaphysics, which is a compendium of smaller treatises. But this is not the reason. The reason is that he is thinking, Aristotle, in a metaphysical sense. That is to say, he's constantly thinking in the light of principles that transcend thinking and language, but never explicitly expressing these principles, because it's impossible. When you read Aristotle, and I will return to this at the end of the podcast, you can actually see this. By seeing, I mean intellectually intuit it, because this is something that you cannot conjure or prove as a demonstration. By the way, demonstration, to be clear, what is demonstration? Demonstration is a proof based on syllogistic inference. The thing I'm talking about is something that is before any inference, that is at the bedrock of inference, so you cannot demonstrate it by inference. Anyway, to say that something is systematic is not wrong. What we mean by systematic? Well, we mean that we have a collection, or better to say whole, made of parts, whose sum is more than the sum of its parts. This means that there is a principle according to which knowledge that is systematical is organized. You can think systematically, you can speak systematically, you can write systematically, but what you can do, and what I want to say and somehow explain in this podcast, is that you cannot have a system. You can qualify some action as systematic, but you cannot have a system, in the sense that for the most part it fulfills the inherent ambition that modern way of thinking gives it. Because modern way of thinking sees the system as ersatz, or replacement for something else that was present in classical philosophy and classical knowledge in general. And that means some kind of knowledge of the whole, of the being in general. System is an ersatz for that. Ersatz, mind you, that is highly subjective. It is my thesis, always been and always will be, that system is in fact, a system understood in the modern sense, is image of man. Because image of man is always present in science as a kind of form in which everything that is known has to be somehow related or related to. There was this notion in antiquity, in early Greek, or better to say later Greek, late antiquity philosophy, with the notion of anthropos. You have a notion of Adam Kadmon in Hebrew traditions, and you have notion of Jesus in Christian tradition. Although in Christian tradition, this notion that truth equals a living, breathing God-man is completely explicit in scholastics and earlier in patristic. This is absolutely the case. The Jesus, or logos, is the measure of truth. All truth is truth in the sense it participates in him. But let's put that aside. What we do now is try to depict what system means for modernity. And as I said, we'll use classical German idealism. Classical German idealism is a highly interesting period in the history of philosophy, incredibly difficult to get into. In my opinion, and I will just throw this as a mental side note, footnote if you like, classical German idealism is a dispute among Protestant theologians for the most part, and it presupposes Protestant culture, Protestant spirit, and Protestant assumptions on the nature of Christianity. So it's very much a localized phenomena. Nevertheless, it is accepted, and its aftermath is being accepted as relevant to the world in general, culture in general, which is in fact not the case, in my opinion. However, when it comes to systems, if you want to understand why people in modern age won't have system, go no further than German idealism. Prepare yourself for a very difficult travail in trying to understand writers as Fichte or Hegel. To approach the German idealism, of course, one has to say a few words about Kant. In this context, Immanuel Kant, that is. In this context, I'll talk about a specific place in Kant's critique of pure reason. That is to say, one of the last chapters of the book, of his so-called transcendental, what's the English translation of Metaphysics? Transcendental teaching on method. Now, this is the part of the book where Kant, in fact, explains what are his motives for writing critique of pure reason. A lot of people who study philosophy and Kant never read those chapters because they consider them to be some kind of afterthought, but they are anything but. There is a chapter called Architectonic of the Pure Mind. And in this chapter, Kant defines architectonic as the art of creating systems. His definition of system is as follows. System is a variety of different cognitions and different varieties of knowledge, all subsumed under one idea. This is the definition of system in Kant. By idea, and this is very important, this is why I take German Idealism to be exemplary. By idea, Kant doesn't mean something that Plato would think as an idea. Idea for Kant is the form of human knowledge that transcends sensual reality by its very definition, but not in the sense that it is something that is outside us, but that it is something that is produced by us. This is very important. Kant believes that we have innate ideas, ideas that are being understood as notions of God, soul, and the totality of the world in general. The ability to conceive the world in general. And the problem is that in theoretical use of the pure mind, or pure reason, or better to say pure mind, because this is accurate when we talk about Kant, and in English translations, for some reason, it is very rarely accurate, mind finds itself in contradictions. So it cannot think, for instance, it cannot think God, proofs of God's existence, as Kant sees them as ontological proofs and such, because they have no relation to possible experience. In Kant's idea, experience is always, in the end, Anschauung, based on Anschauung, on intuition. The word is often used, but what he means by Anschauung is sensual perception taken in a general sense, not in a sense empirism understands it, because in Kant every perception is in fact a combination of the notions, of intellectual notions that we project as consciousness in the world and what is given, as he would say, from the world. So that's very specific for him. But in the end, pure intellect doesn't work in theory, it works in practice. And one possible practice in using the ideas is creation of systems, because as Kant says, those ideas are necessary. We have to have an idea, for instance, of God, because our moral actions would be impossible if we would not be able to postulate the fulfillment of those actions. Now, Kant is very right here in the one sense. He's right in the sense that every action that is natural or innate to human being has to have a possibility of fulfillment. Somebody like Nietzsche, for instance, would say, "Oh, who are you to expect the reward for your actions?" That's very easy to say, but that doesn't have much to do with the way human beings function or exist. This is not the way, anyway. But take it as you like it, not to digress. What Kant means is that, for instance, the notion of God is necessary as a practical postulate, and is proven to be valid as such. This is a practical proof of God's existence, mind you. But also there is an idea of system, the wholeness of knowledge that is innate, so thinks Kant, to human mind. And that system would be the unification of all modes of human knowledge under the one idea. And this was a kind of glove that Kant threw in the face of his younger contemporaries that have built the classical German idealism, and from here comes the idea of the system. Now, to understand where this leads and how it ends up, it's best to take the most boring, probably, and most difficult to read philosopher of German idealism, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who was younger Kant's contemporary, who owe Immanuel Kant his recognition in the German public because Kant promoted him, although they had a falling out eventually, as all those people do after some time. And he was an interpret of Kant's philosophy, and he thought that his own philosophy was nothing else than Kant's philosophy, but interpreted in the spirit, not by the letter, which is, by the way, typical for some reason for Protestant exegetes of anything, but I'm not an expert. I cannot but notice. Anyway, Fichte's notion was that Kant didn't go far enough. That is to say, he gave only a Grundriss, kind of like an outline of what has to be done, and Fichte tried to do it. Namely, Fichte's idea was, if we don't have system of knowledge, although all knowledge that we have acquired through history, and by this they mean modern natural sciences. These are only sciences, for real sciences for these people. In a Newtonian sense, that is to say, that was modern at that age. What is this idea that connects them all? Because this idea, so thinks Fichte, this form, as he would say, has to be present in all kinds of knowledge, but people are not conscious of it. We're not conscious of it throughout history. What is this? And he thought he found the answer. He said, this principle is the principle of identity, which says I am I, or I is I, or I equals I. By I am thinking, of course, of the pronoun. This is the first principle of all knowledge. Now, why is that? Well, I told you before, German idealism and notion of idealism in general in modern philosophy is very specific thing. Idealism is a kind of metaphysics that deals with representations. The cornerstone of idealism is that all knowledge is a representational knowledge, and the only form in which knowledge can come to us and be relevant as knowledge is representational knowledge. What is different than representation and is expressed in the representation is another matter, but we cannot explain that in the other way than coming towards it from the standpoint of consciousness and intelligence. This is idealism. For some idealists, there are only representations, even going so far as to say that there are absolutely no things outside our perception, that esse est percipi, being is being perceived, not being perceived doesn't exist, something that is not content of our senses. By the way, very important thing in idealism, German idealism and idealism, New Age, modern idealism, always relies upon senses. It's a strange kind of, even one could say, strange kind of metaphysical skepticism. It has nothing to do, for instance, that's what I want to say, with Platonic idealism, with Plato's ideas and such things. Nothing. This is even maybe completely opposite, and one has to note these things because, as I said, the term system itself is almost in 90% of the cases today in scholarly literature conflated with something that is not system. That is to say, it is applied to philosophies that are completely out of the scope of modernity, completely opposite. But it is similar in form, in verbal form, in syntactic form, in maybe even in conceptual form, similar, not the same, but similar with what existed before it, in what exists now, but rarely anyone thinks about it. So this is how this comes to pass. This is the same thing with idealism. So Fichte works on this assumption. That is to say that any principle of knowledge, any principle of reality, mind you, because unreal knowledge doesn't interest anybody here, is I. Now, what is this I? What is this consciousness, conscious subject? First of all, for Fichte, it's not consciousness. It's an act. As he would say, Tat in German, and there is even Tathandlung, his coinage. Tathandlung would be something like factual activity or something like that. Very hard to translate. Now this is the pure act of which we are not conscious. This means that I exists before everything, but it exists in a way that it is not conscious of itself, that it is not an object. This is very important, because in idealism, nothing exists if it's not object, because idealism works, and system thinking in general, upon the notion of subject-object split. When we know something as a given, as something that we cannot change or modify, or as something that is real, different of us in our cognition, that is our object. So when says Fichte, when I say I is I, this really means I posit I, because this unconscious pure act all of the sudden stops and reflects upon itself, making itself an object to itself, becoming an object to an extent that is objectified. It ceases to be an act. It ceases to be free. That is because this act, as Fichte understands it, quite consequently, I would add, is that I is absolutely free. It's absolutely free activity. And reflecting upon it in something that he calls intellektuelle Anschauung, intellectual intuition, we objectify it. And this is how the system is created. The basis, however, of the system is a pure ego, pure activity of the ego in the metaphysical sense. When I say metaphysical, I mean in the sense of our individuality, human I, and some kind of absolute I. To understand discrepancy between these two would take a lifetime, I think, because explanation doesn't really exist, because in all probability it is a contradictory metaphysical notion. But this is how German idealists thought, and Kant before them also, because Kant's philosophy is based on this notion of I, that is unifying principle of everything, because since everything is given in subjective forms, in representations, there has to be something that keeps all this together, because cognition has to be one cognition, knowledge has to be one knowledge in order to exist. It has to be not something that is in chaos of unconnected parts. And connecting or unifying principle is I. But Kant never explains what this I is, because he cannot explain it. He thought that it, in its original metaphysical form, it is inaccessible to our knowledge, because it transcends senses, the possibility of sensual intuition, which is the basis of our knowledge. Fichte thought that this is not the case. You can observe this pure synthesis, active act of synthesis in its action, because you are it in effect, but you are only at one point in your life, literary, starting to reflect upon it. And this is how systems are built, and Fichte's idea was that from this reflection, men have to comb the whole history and prove and demonstrate systematic essence of all our knowledge. But all our knowledge, you think natural sciences. There's even one point when he mentions that idea of angels dancing on the head of the pin. This is, of course, the Protestant jab at Catholic Church. Nobody ever in scholastics counted angels dancing on the pin. He contrasts this to mechanics in order to show that theology of that kind, traditional theology, is what he means by this Catholic theology, is nonsense, but can have this systemic form. But then that form is worthless. Whereas mechanics, there is a real content, and there's real content. The laws of mechanics, the applications of mechanics are built upon this consciousness, original consciousness. And what one has to find is the systemic form in which this special science connects with all the other sciences. This is what Fichte means. And this is one of impetuses for going for further development of the German idealism. But what interests us here the most is how system is created. And we'll finish this part of the podcast on that note, because what we have here is the idea that system comes from pure ego, pure subject, pure I, unconscious consciousness even. Something that is not conceivable without constant referring to subjectivity, with the goal and the telos or purpose of absolute objectivity. This is what is very dangerous with systemic notions of system. In the other episode, we'll try to delve deeper into it, and then we'll try to demonstrate, not demonstrate, but show, for intuition or for your consideration, that this does not apply, at least in philosophy, to philosophers of antiquity, which say something that is superficially similar, but in fact worlds apart from this. Anyway, thank you for your attention, and please be eager in waiting for the second part of this podcast. This was Branko Malić of Kali Tribune.